I got married, and my parents didn't show up. The reason? Even worse than you think. I sent them invitations. I called. I followed up. They ignored me. Then on my wedding day their seats were empty. And why? Because my younger sister wasn't engaged yet, and they wanted her to be first. I married the love of my life without them there. And when they finally called, you won't believe what they said. They accused me of excluding them. So I gave them exactly what they gave me: silence. Growing up, I always knew where I stood in my family. My younger sister Lauren was the star, the golden child, the one my parents proudly showcased to everyone. She was effortlessly beautiful, smart, and incredibly charismatic. Even as a kid, she had a way of drawing people in, and my parents couldn't have been prouder. I, on the other hand, was just there. I wasn't ugly, but I wasn't stunning like Lauren. I wasn't a genius, but I did well enough in school. I didn't have the kind of presence that made people stop and take notice. And in my family, being just fine wasn't enough. My parents were the kind of people who loved bragging about their children, but I quickly realized that I wasn't the daughter they wanted to boast about. At every family gathering, every school event, every casual conversation with friends, it was always, "Lauren just won another competition." Or, "Did you know Lauren was offered an internship by a top company?" Meanwhile, my accomplishments, things I had worked hard for, were barely acknowledged. I remember once in high school I was so excited because I had won an art competition. It wasn't anything major, just a local event, but to me it felt huge. I rushed home to tell my parents, expecting even just a small word of encouragement. Instead, my mom barely looked up from her phone and said, "That's nice, honey. By the way, Lauren has a big soccer match this weekend. We should all go support her." That was how it always was. No matter what I did, it would never be as impressive as whatever Lauren had accomplished. At some point, I stopped trying to compete for their attention. I focused on my own life, my own happiness. I didn't resent Lauren, how could I? It wasn't her fault that our parents treated her like royalty. But I did resent them. I resented how they made me feel like an afterthought in my own family. I kept my distance as I grew older. I still called them, still visited during holidays, still kept things polite. But the bond? It wasn't there. My parents were obsessed with appearances, so as long as I maintained some level of contact, they didn't push too hard. That was fine with me. Then, when I got engaged to my longtime boyfriend Daniel, I thought maybe this time will be different. Maybe for once my parents would be excited for me, would see me as someone worth celebrating. I was wrong. Their reaction to my engagement wasn't excitement, it was shock. And not the happy kind. They didn't congratulate me. They didn't ask about wedding plans. They just stared. And that's when I realized the truth. They weren't happy for me because, in their minds, Lauren was supposed to get married first. I should have seen it coming. The moment my parents reacted with stunned silence to my engagement, I should have known they wouldn't be supportive. But a small, naive part of me still hoped they would come around. After all, this was my wedding. A once-in-a-lifetime event. My chance to finally have a moment that was about me, not Lauren. I tried to involve them. I told them about the venue Daniel and I had chosen. How we wanted something elegant but intimate. I talked about dress shopping, the guest list, the little details that made me excited. But every time their responses were dismissive. "Oh, that sounds nice," my mom would say, her tone flat. "Are you sure you don't want to wait a little longer? Maybe give Lauren a chance to settle down first?" My dad asked at one point, as if my life needed to be on hold for her. I should have cut my losses then and there. But I still sent them formal invitations, both physical and digital, just to be sure they received them. And when they didn't RSVP, I followed up. No response. Days before the wedding, I called. No answer. I tried not to let it ruin things. I had a fiancé who adored me, friends who were genuinely excited to celebrate with us, and a wedding that, despite everything, I was proud of planning. And then the big day arrived. Everyone who mattered was there. Daniel's family, my closest friends, even some distant relatives I hadn't expected to show up. But when I walked down that aisle, there were two very obvious empty seats where my parents should have been. I felt the sting of it, but I refused to let it break me. I smiled, I danced, I celebrated. This was my day, and I wasn't going to let them ruin it. Still, people noticed. Family members asked about my parents, whispering about their absence. Some tried to cover for them, saying maybe they were sick, maybe there was an emergency. But I knew the truth. They chose not to come. A few days after the wedding, I called them. They finally picked up, and before I could even ask why they hadn't shown up, my mother let out a dramatic sigh. "We're so upset about missing your wedding," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "But honestly, you really should have sent us a formal invitation. It was very hurtful to be excluded like that." I nearly laughed. Excluded? I had sent them multiple invitations. I knew they had received them. They were gaslighting me, trying to make it seem like I was the one at fault. But instead of arguing, I simply said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," and hung up. Because at that moment I realized something. They weren't just bad parents. They were selfish people. And I was done chasing after their approval. After that ridiculous phone call, I was fuming. My parents had the audacity to act like I was the one who had done something wrong. But deep down I knew there was more to it. I vented to Daniel, who had been nothing but patient and supportive throughout the entire ordeal. He listened quietly as I told him about my parents' pathetic excuse, then let out a bitter laugh. "You really don't see it, do you?" he said. "See what? They didn't skip your wedding because of some missing invitation," he said, shaking his head. "They skipped it because they didn't want you getting married before Lauren." First I thought he was joking, but then he reminded me of things I had overlooked. Like how my parents weren't thrilled when I told them I was engaged. They hadn't congratulated me. They hadn't smiled or asked about the proposal. Instead, they had looked stunned. Like how, at our engagement party, my parents had spent most of the night on the phone with Lauren, who was crying. Daniel had overheard them trying to calm her down, whispering to her while pretending not to notice anyone watching. Like how, throughout the entire wedding planning process, my parents had been distant, uninterested, and even sulking. It all made sense. Lauren wasn't engaged. She didn't even have a serious boyfriend. And in my parents' twisted minds, it wasn't fair for me to get married first. Lauren was their golden child. Their beautiful, successful, perfect daughter. She was supposed to have the big, extravagant wedding first. I had unknowingly broken their unspoken rule. Stung. No, it infuriated me. I had spent my entire life being second to Lauren. Every birthday, every achievement, every little moment had always been overshadowed by her. And now, when I finally had something for myself, my parents still couldn't let me have it. That was the moment I decided I was done. Done chasing their approval. Done playing second to Lauren. Done pretending like we were some happy, normal family. If my wedding wasn't important to them, then neither were they. I wasn't going to keep holding on to people who so clearly didn't care about me. And I definitely wasn't going to keep quiet about it. After piecing everything together, I realized I couldn't just let this go. I was done playing the role of the less important daughter. My wedding had been one of the most important days of my life, and my own parents had deliberately skipped it, just to protect Lauren's ego. I made my decision right then and there. I wasn't going to speak to them anymore. Not even for the sake of keeping up appearances. I knew they cared deeply about their image, about what people thought of them. They wanted the perfect, polished family. They wanted people to admire them, to believe they had raised two successful daughters. But they had made it clear, I was nothing more than an afterthought to them. So I walked away. I stopped reaching out. No more calls. No more polite texts just to keep the peace. I didn't block them, but I wasn't going to be the one keeping the relationship afloat anymore. If they wanted to talk to me, they could put in the effort. And guess what? They didn't. Weeks turned into months, and I didn't hear a single word from them. No check-ins, no house married life. Nothing. They had ignored me just as easily as they had ignored my wedding. But I wasn't sad about it. In fact, I felt free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bending over backward to please people who would never be satisfied. I wasn't clinging to a relationship that had always been one-sided. Instead, I focused on my life, my happiness, and my marriage. And then months later I got the news. Lauren was finally engaged. A few weeks ago, I started hearing whispers from our extended family. Lauren had gotten engaged. Apparently, she had been dating this guy for about a year, and he had finally proposed. My first thought? Good for her. I had no interest in her life anymore, and honestly I figured my parents were probably thrilled. And of course they were. Unlike my wedding, which they ignored completely, my parents were going all out for Lauren. They were bragging online, telling everyone how perfect her engagement was, and dropping hints about how they were planning the event of the year. expensive venues, high-end designers, a Vera Wang wedding dress. It was clear they were sparing no expense for Lauren's big day. I didn't care, until my parents reached out to me. After 8 months of complete silence, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "We need to talk." That was it. No greeting. No "how are you?" No acknowledgement that they had completely ignored me after my wedding. Just a demand. Curious, I decided to hear them out. I wasn't expecting much, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to see what they wanted. The moment I picked up, my mother's tone was sharp. "I can't believe you did this to your own sister." I blinked. "What?" "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Lauren is devastated because no one in the family is coming to her engagement party, and it's your fault." I was completely lost. How is that my fault? "Because you've been going around telling everyone lies about us." That's when it clicked. Over the past several months, whenever relatives had asked why my parents skipped my wedding, I had simply told them the truth. I didn't go out of my way to spread gossip or try to turn people against my parents. I just answered their questions honestly. And now, apparently, the truth had consequences. From what I gathered, after hearing how my parents had treated me, most of our relatives had lost respect for them. People who should have been excited for Lauren's wedding were suddenly less interested. They were busy, when invited to the engagement party, coming up with excuses not to go. My parents were furious. They accused me of ruining their reputation, of trying to make them look bad out of jealousy. My mother kept insisting that I had orchestrated this on purpose to sabotage Lauren's wedding. I just laughed. "You think I forced our family to turn their backs on you?" I asked. "No. You did that. I just told them the truth." That set her off even more. "You need to fix this. You need to tell everyone that you lied, and that we didn't actually mean to miss your wedding." I cut her off. "I'm not lying for you." That was the end of that conversation. I hung up, and for the first time in years I didn't feel any guilt about it. After my conversation with my parents, I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I started getting texts from cousins, aunts, and uncles, all saying the same thing. "Your parents are trying to do damage control." Apparently, my mother and father had gone into full panic mode. They were calling up every relative, claiming that I was spreading false rumors about them out of jealousy. They were painting themselves as victims, two loving parents who had been cruelly betrayed by their own daughter. They even went as far as saying that I had never invited them to my wedding in the first place, that I had excluded them on purpose just so I could later claim they abandoned me. It was ridiculous. The best part? No one was buying it. By now, our relatives had already seen my parents' favoritism for years. They had always treated Lauren like a princess while I was just there. So instead of turning on me, most of them just laughed behind my parents' backs. "They're desperate," my aunt texted me. "They can't stand the fact that people see them for what they really are." It was karma in real time. Then Lauren texted me. I wasn't expecting it, and honestly I debated not even opening the message. But curiosity got the better of me. Her text was exactly what I imagined. "I can't believe how selfish you are. Mom and Dad have done everything for you, and you repay them by ruining my wedding? You're bitter because you couldn't have a wedding like mine, and now you're trying to make sure no one comes. Grow up and stop acting like a victim." I stared at my phone for a solid minute, debating how to respond. Then I decided I wouldn't. I didn't know Lauren anything. I had wasted too many years trying to get along with a sister who had never once treated me with kindness. Instead, I just blocked her number. Apparently that wasn't enough for her though, because a few hours later my husband got a message from her. Lauren had gone out of her way to track down his number and text him, demanding that he control me. "Tell your wife to stop embarrassing herself. If she has any dignity left, she'll apologize to our parents." My husband, he thought it was hilarious. He sent me a screenshot of her message with a simple reply, "You must be joking." Then he blocked her too. The fact that Lauren had resorted to texting my husband, someone she barely even knew, proved just how desperate she was. She wasn't mad that I had lied because I hadn't. She was mad because for once she wasn't the center of attention. And that was not my problem. After blocking Lauren and watching my parents' desperate attempts to control the narrative crumble, I thought the chaos might finally die down. I underestimated their persistence. A few days later, I received a long-winded email from my mother. Unlike her usual passive-aggressive jabs, this one was performative, filled with fake concern and emotional manipulation. "We don't understand why you're doing this to us. We are still your parents and we have always loved you. You are making a mistake by cutting us out over some silly misunderstanding. Lauren's wedding is coming up, and we would like to move past all of this unnecessary drama. It's time for you to apologize and set the record straight. Families forgive each other, and we expect you to do the same. Don't make a decision you'll regret forever. Love, Mom and Dad." I read it twice, letting the words sink in. They weren't sorry. They weren't even acknowledging anything they had done. They still expected me to take the blame, me to fix everything, me to fall back in line. And worst of all, they actually thought I would. I debated whether to respond, but honestly, it wasn't worth it. Instead, I forwarded the email to my husband with a simple caption: "You were right. They really do think I'm that stupid." Then I deleted it. I thought ignoring them would be the end of it, but my parents weren't finished. Since I wouldn't reply, they went straight to the next person they thought they could manipulate, my Aunt Margaret. Margaret was one of the few relatives who had always remained neutral in family matters. She was kind, fair, and mostly kept to herself, but she also hated drama. So when she called me, I was not expecting the words that came out of her mouth. "Your parents are asking me to talk some sense into you." I groaned. "Of course they are. They think if I remind you about family loyalty, you'll stop being so stubborn and come apologize. They also want you to make an announcement saying they didn't skip your wedding over Lauren." I almost laughed. "Margaret, do you believe them?" She let out a humorless chuckle. "Of course not. I've known for years how they treat you. They don't want to fix anything. They just want their reputation intact. But I figured you'd want to know what they were up to." I sighed in relief. "Thank you for telling me. And I hope they don't drag you into this any further." Margaret paused before adding, "Oh, I already made sure of that." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She laughed. "I told them I wasn't going to be at Lauren's wedding either. If they couldn't bother showing up for their own daughter's wedding, why should I make time for hers?" I blinked. You really said that?" "Yep. And I wasn't the first. A lot of relatives are starting to feel the same way." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me anymore. My parents had spent years putting Lauren on a pedestal, treating her as the only child who mattered. Now they were finally dealing with the consequences. People weren't ignoring their behavior anymore. And Lauren's perfect wedding? It was about to have a lot of empty seats. As Lauren's wedding day got closer, the cracks in my parents' carefully constructed facade became impossible to ignore. The relatives who had always been politely distant were now actively avoiding them. Invitations to the engagement party had been met with cold indifference. Excuses piled up. Suddenly, people had last-minute conflicts, travel plans, or health issues that just happened to prevent them from attending. My parents were furious. Lauren, she was spiraling. I had cut off direct contact with them, but that didn't stop the updates from trickling in through relatives. My cousin Melissa, who had always kept a close eye on family gossip, sent me a text one evening. "You won't believe this. Your parents called Uncle Ron today, practically begging him to come to the wedding. He told them he wasn't interested in supporting people who treat their own daughter like a second-class citizen." I stared at my phone, stunned. Uncle Ron had always been diplomatic. For him to outright reject them like that? This was serious. And it wasn't just him. By the time the wedding week rolled around, the majority of extended family had backed out. My parents tried everything: guilt, manipulation, even bribery, to convince people to attend. But it was no use. Their years of favoritism had finally caught up to them, and the people they had spent a lifetime impressing simply didn't care anymore. The final nail in the coffin? Lauren's dream venue, a massive luxury estate booked months in advance, was now at risk of being embarrassingly empty. Melissa texted me again 2 days before the wedding. "Your mom is freaking out. She called Grandma last night in tears. She kept saying it was your fault, that you ruined their reputation." I rolled my eyes. Of course they were still blaming me. Not their own behavior. Not their own choices. Me. At that point, I had already made peace with my decision to stay out of it. But part of me wondered, what would happen after the wedding? Would they finally let this go? Would they ever admit they were wrong? The answer came 2 weeks later. Lauren's wedding was, from what I heard, an awkward, hollow event. A handful of obligated family members showed up, but the energy was completely off. My parents had spent tens of thousands of dollars on a wedding that ended up feeling empty. There was no grand, picture-perfect celebration. No gushing crowd to admire Lauren. No adoring relatives lining up to tell my parents what amazing parents they were. And after it was all over? Silence. No apology. No attempt to reconcile. They had lost, but their pride wouldn't let them admit it. And honestly, I was okay with that. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for their approval. I wasn't hoping for them to finally choose me. I had already won. I had a husband who loved and respected me. I had in-laws who treated me better than my own parents ever did. I had friends and family members who had shown genuine support. And I had peace. I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations anymore. They had made their choices. Now they had to live with them.